Planet Green. Writer Oliver Green. After that, let's get going. Every day, you wake up in your bed, in your house, in your neighborhood, in your community, in your province, in your country, and in the world. But you probably never question it. You get ready for your day, you immerse yourself in your society, you go to work, come home, eat a food that's unique to your country. Maybe sit down and watch a sports game unique to your country. And sometimes you even celebrate a holiday unique to your nation. But do you ever wonder why the things that make up your life is normal? Or why the place that you live is defined by borders? Well, in this video, we will be helping you answer those questions.
Hello everybody, my name's Ned, but I'm commonly known as Ned the History Head. In this video, we'll be answering the driving question, how can an understanding of nationalism help us understand today? We'll be going into depth on 3 different case studies, which should help us answer that question and the question's writer listed earlier.
Our first case study that we need to learn is the story of Italian unification. It was said that the story began when Prince Niccolo Machiavelli wrote the book The Prince in 1532. The book shared a set of beliefs about a common enemy to Sardinia, which at the time was a leading power. Although it wasn't until 1848, on the 23rd of March, that action was taken due to his ideas. King Charles Albert of Sardinia led a strong army against the Austrian power in an attempt to conquer the bordering city-state. Although there was no outcome, this was the first symbolic act. In 1855, Sardinia and Napoleonic France allied and fought in a victorious war. This was Italy's War of Independence. Together, the two nations united the rest of Italy into one nation. By 1861, Italy was united, and Emmanuel III became the first king of the proud country.
With fresh unification came love and pride in their country, much like America a little more than a decade later. In an important event such as Italy's unification, it is crucial not just to see what has changed, but to find what has stayed the same. In this case, the culture, ethnicity, and religious views had stayed the same since before unification. Well, now that you've learned about that, make sure you take the info I've given to heart and keep it in mind as we move on to our next topic. Take it away, writer.
Who is this writer you tell of? I am King Ride the Great, ruler of all land. That's enough for now, although it does give a nice segue to our next topic, which happens to be all about confederation. Though it's important when finding the answer to our driving question, to have a full understanding of the question. Let's start by breaking it down. Before we get to the word nationalism, we're going to start with nation. Nation, a stable community of people formed on the basis of common language, territory, history, ethnicity, or common culture. Okay, now that is in our minds, let's get bigger. Nationalism, a love and pride of one's country or nation. Now that we have both those terms, let's move on to our second case study. Back to you, Ned.
British influence on Canada spans back to the 1600s, when Canada was nothing but a trading ground for the beloved fur trade. But it wasn't until the 1800s that things got interesting. Which brings me to the start of my next story.
Canada in the 1800s was very different to the modern day. To be precise, Canada wasn't even a thing, and nearly half of the provinces that make up the country today didn't exist. This story starts in 1840, when Canada was nothing but a few disorganized colonies. You had New Brunswick, PEI, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland and Labrador, New Caledonia, and Vancouver's Island on the west coast. You also had the vast area of land called Rupert's Land, which was owned by HBC at the time. In the epicenter of it all, though, was the province of Canada. Although it had been united in 1841, the area of land still had a large divide. The French and the British had tension ever since the first British colonists came years before. By the time Manifest Destiny was in full steam, Canadian air was thick with dispute. John A. Macdonald knew there was only one way to keep Canada separate from the barbaric South. The Great Coalition between Canada West and Canada East united the French and English and was the first major step in future confederation. The nationalism of the country was stronger than past disputes, stronger than unneeded hate. By 1867, Canada consisted of 4 strong colonies, and by 1949, Canada became the country it is today.
Hey, get away! This place is mine. Yep, all mine. Anything gets in the way of me settling here, well, let's just say they'll be gone faster than my cup of tea this morning. Okay. I knew that guy was kind of weird when I first met him. Although, that does tie in pretty perfectly to our next topic. In the late 1800s, Canada was just getting used to being confederated. Settlement westward drove Canada much like Manifest Destiny. With construction of the CP Railway, which would unite Canada from sea to sea, Canada was expanding quickly. Although, in 1776, Canadian history would fall down a deep, dark hole. That year, the government passed a series of laws called the Indian Act. The laws were said to help Canadian expansion. The consequences of the act, however, were led by a series of events which resulted in an attempted extinction of a culture.
In the government's eyes, the First Nations people were seen as barriers or obstacles in the way. They believed that the only way to rid of the obstacle, besides for killing them, was to assimilate them into the European culture and religion. They had the idea of, if you aren't going to help us, then why don't you be us? Their primary action was to ban all cultural events. In the midst of that, a system called the treaty system was introduced. The system made it so that every time a settler was going to settle on land where First Nations resided, they would have to create a treaty. The exchange of rights often was heavily biased towards the government. One of the outcomes were the reserve system that was the start of an intense oppression that we still see today. From the Indian Act also came residential schools. In Canadian history, the residential school was recognized as the closest thing the First Peoples of Canada got to a cultural genocide. The schools taught First Nations children to be ashamed of their culture. In the many years that residential schools were active, it was said that nearly 6,000 children did not make it back home. 15,000 children as young as 4 years old went to these schools, and almost none left without physical or mental trauma. After the last residential school closed in 1996, many actions were taken to restore reconciliation, although residential schools and the attempted assimilation left behind a generational oppression that may never go away. Throughout this entire chapter of history, British colonialism has been the source of continuity.
Thanks, Ned. Let's take a large step back and a trip down memory lane to our first case study. In Italy, the nationalism really began to form after Italy became a united country. Today we see that same nationalism in many ways. Just in Italy, the love of art and rich culture fills the country's streets. The proudness you may feel of your nation's sports also stems from that same love of your ethnicity and your country's independence. Although this nationalism seems harmless, it makes up a huge part of the world, as you probably know. In Canada, the nationalism that confederated the country is the reason why us Canadians are not American. You probably also noticed the bilingualism of our country today. That was caused by the Great Coalition government all those years ago. Living in Deep Cove, we are surrounded by not only First Nation culture, but the signs of oppression that the Indian Act of 1876 ensued all those years ago. We drive by reserves, which are one of the last places where First Nation culture can be passed on. We drive by road signs with First Nations names. You go to the parks, named after First Nations areas, and you may even see cultural trauma play out in the poverty on streets. You also see that many of the same outcomes of this kind of nationalism and systemic racism of the African American population. The same nationalism connects all the way back to Nazi Germany as well, and the persecution of the Jewish population. Understanding the cause and the beliefs can help you understand current events that impact your life, such as Black Lives Matter or the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the First Nations oppression. It's astronomical how much past
nationalism plays a role in our lives. This brings us to the answer to the driving question. An understanding of nationalism can help us understand the world through different perspectives. It helps understand geographical borders, the ethnicity of countries' inhabitants, current events, and many things that you experience in the daily. I hope from this video you've not only learned the stories of nationalism and history, but you've gained a new point of view on the world around you. My name is Ryder.
And Ned.
And this has been A New Point of View.